our ultimate aim here today is to talk really about resilience and the science behind resilience, and I think we will circle back to it, but I think that's a really good starting point, that notion that it's okay to not be okay, and that in fact it's essential at times to stop and say, you know what, it's not all okay at the moment, I'm having a tough time, and to recognise that. So I suppose to move back and look at what a lot of our audience are experiencing at the moment, and lockdowns and the uncertainty that we've already talked about. I'm just wondering, in terms of mental health generally and the psychological impact and the long-term cost, it occurred to me, I suppose, listening to what you've written, or looking at what you've written and listening to what you've said about COVID-19 and the enforced abrupt isolation, that may actually be the longest and the deepest cut that COVID leaves on people. We might end up with a generation who have long-term psychological impacts. What do you think about that?
The only way we can equate this in contemporary or relatively modern history is to equate the impact of the COVID pandemic to people who experienced Blitz during World War II. It's incredibly different, but also incredibly similar. It was a sustained period of time where absolutely everything was utterly different. And what we do know for sure is that it is a period of time that no one who is old enough will ever forget. It is one of those periods in history that people will always remember aspects of. So there is no doubt that it will leave a mark in the sense that it will always be etched in people's memories and living history, but also in kind of contemporary history, it will always be recorded in history books that this global pandemic spread and that there was a huge toll, and you know that despite modern science's absolute best efforts, it took time to reach a conclusion with it, whatever that may be. That's still uncertain at this point. There is definitely a significant risk to people's mental health because there's uncertainty. We're heading into austerity or a period of economic recession. We know from the psychological literature, from the science that already exists, that recessions by themselves have a huge psychological impact on people. So if no other aspect of the COVID pandemic leaves a mark, we know that will affect people, and it will affect people from most socioeconomic classes, and it'll particularly affect people from socioeconomic areas that are maybe less resourced. We know that for sure. We also know that for people who have existing mental health problems, this has been a very, very, very stressful time. Their access to supports and routine services, things like day hospitals, rehabilitation programs, and you know the peer support that they normally, or some of them would normally rely on, is less available or not available at all. And we know that that's counterproductive to their mental health. We also know that people exist in isolation. Isolation is not good for the vast majority of people's mental health, and many people live alone. And because of that, many people who are in lockdown are isolated. So we absolutely know what all the factors are, and we can look at it and kind of say they are the ingredients of a huge psychological impact. We don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. We don't know what the finished product will look like. And in all likelihood, as you said, you know, we're a long way off really appreciating what the full psychological impact is. What we do know is that a lot of the factors or ingredients that would contribute to poor psychological well-being are already in the pot mixing.
Yeah, and I think you know, touching on that aspect of it, access to supports and how it's been truncated and in some cases completely cut off very abruptly, and the whole notion then of people needing to look out for themselves and for each other, and the whole piece around self-care. What are your thoughts on self-care? Maybe if to start with, to explain what the principles of self-care are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually, I'm delighted you've asked that, because we're here to talk about resilience, but actually for me, we're really here to talk about self-care. And I know we're going to get to resilience in a second, but it's nice to actually lay out now the principles around, or the ethos around self-care. Self-care is a set of actions and behaviors and routines and rituals that allow an individual person to tend to their own mental health. It's not a way of preventing mental illness or preventing stress or preventing, psychological challenges in life, but it is a, I suppose, a kind of an ethos, or a kind of a
worldview,
a worldview, or a view of self, of looking after oneself and actually loving yourself. We live in a country where the term "you love yourself" is weaponized. There's no greater insult in Ireland than "your man loves himself." It guts you. There's no coming back from that.
It's unfortunate for psychologists.
It's very unfortunate for psychologists, because actually the answer should be, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
And if I don't love me, no one else can love me, and I can't love anyone else, because that's where it starts. You can't, that's where that principle begins within you. And self-care is about affording yourself time to do things that are good for you, but also hold a mindset that's kind to yourself. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay not to be perfect. It's okay to be upset and stressed and sad, and these things are okay, because often it's not the very nature of the event itself that causes problems. Certainly, things happen in the world that are really stressful and very sad, but it's our reaction to it often. You often hear people say, "Oh, but other people have it worse." That's true, sure, absolutely, they do. But what you're experiencing is hard also, and pushing that away and almost chastising yourself for acknowledging that you're suffering in some way yourself compounds your suffering. So self-care is about, as a set of principles or as an ethos, is around acknowledging that actually what I'm experiencing in myself is sore or difficult, and that I need to look after myself and care for myself in that way. Self-care is not selfish. Yeah. There's a huge perception that to take time out for yourself and care for yourself is treating yourself or pampering yourself, or
rewarding yourself.
Rewarding yourself.
It has to be earned.
Yeah, and there's a huge paradox around that idea that you treat yourself or you reward yourself when you self-care, because what happens then is that when you have a good day, you treat yourself to something, and when you've a bad day, when you really need to self-care, you don't, because you feel you don't deserve it. And that can be, that's a huge problem. And it's kind of emerged from the commercialization of self-care to, companies encourage you to treat yourself, or, a payday gift, or a treat, some sort of kindness to yourself. But that's not kindness. Kindness is going out on a really difficult, bad day and saying to yourself, it's okay, you made a mistake today, or this happened and it was bad, but you still deserve all of the love and compassion and kindness that you would have had access to on any good day.
We've teased the audience enough about resilience at this stage, so I think, and maybe to start off, it would be nice to maybe clearly outline what resilience is, and I think very importantly what it isn't, because we've talked about the evolving situation and the reactionary phase, and certainly resilience has almost become a buzzword that has popped into the public consciousness, and I kind of feel it's a word that's been used to almost beat people with in some situations, and it doesn't seem right.
It's exactly that, and actually, I know we've spoken about this a little bit before we came on, and I absolutely agree completely. Resilience has experienced a commercialization in the past 7, 8, 10 years, and we've seen a kind of an intensification of that over the last 10 months. I'll tell you a little bit about what resilience is, but I think you're quite right. We'll spend more time probably talking about what resilience isn't. Resilience is your ability to continue to function relatively normally despite adversity. So it's the ability to continue to live, continue to do things, continue to hold yourself despite very difficult experiences in life happening. It's sometimes characterized or sometimes described as your bounce back ability. And it's not that. It's probably better described as your grow back ability. You're not expected to bounce back after something bad happening, because that's not how we as people exist. That's not how we function. We don't just hop up after a negative experience and keep going. You know yourself, or I certainly know, if something bad happens or if something happens that sets me back, it takes a couple of days to regain my confidence, to get back to normal. And it can take longer depending on what it is that happens. And the resilience that we're talking about, the scientific study of resilience and the psychological content around resilience, is very much around how you get back up and going, or how you keep going in very difficult circumstances. Resilience and self-care are really closely linked, because in the absence of that love for yourself or compassion towards yourself that we were talking about just a few minutes ago, resilience really struggles to emerge. And the best way to, I suppose, give an example of that is that anyone who's ever gone to a gym and or engaged in any kind of regular exercise knows that your rest days are as important as your exercise days, because they allow your muscles to recuperate and to actually grow stronger, and that you're better for your rest days. And psychologically, we're exactly the same. We need those rest periods, which self-care allows us to engage in order to be psychologically stronger and psychologically more resilient.